I'm Sally, and my husband Tommy and I used to work at the same place. Tommy, who is 2 years older than me, was my senior at work. We became close when we ended up on the same project team a few years later and started dating soon after. 2 years into our relationship, we got married. After our daughter was born, I decided to quit my job. I loved my work, but my mother-in-law told Tommy that it was strange for a daughter-in-law to be working. So Tommy asked me to focus on household chores instead. From then on, I became a stay-at-home mom. We had our occasional fights, but overall we lived a peaceful and happy life. Then, one day, when our daughter was in elementary school, Tommy came home from work in the middle of the day. This was unusual, so I asked him what happened. It happened so suddenly that I asked him what was going on, and he answered, "Not only was the job hard, but I was also being harassed by my boss, which caused me to become depressed. I consulted with a doctor at the hospital. I quit my job because someone told me I should quit." When I pressed for details, he explained, "My job was tough, and I was also facing harassment from my boss. I've been diagnosed with depression. The doctor advised me to quit, so I did." He also told me, "I don't want you to have any more contact with anyone at the company." I felt so bad for not realizing that Tommy was so traumatized. It was really heartbreaking that Tommy was in so much pain and he couldn't notice. I felt terrible for not noticing how much he was struggling. I thought it would be best for Tommy to take some time off to recover. Our income took a hit, but I believed we could manage with some budgeting and my savings from before we got married. Above all else, I thought it was important that Tommy recover mentally and be able to return to society. However, 6 months passed, and Tommy's condition didn't improve. We started using my savings to cover his medical expenses. I decided to take up a part-time job to help out. I thought that once Tommy returned to work, I could save my part-time earnings. Our daughter was now old enough to help with chores, which was a big relief. I did my best to take care of housework and work to the best of my ability so as to not burden Tommy. But Tommy's depression didn't get better. Of course, I knew it wouldn't heal that quickly. He would go to the clinic during the day and come back in the evening, only to laze around in the house. He seemed fine when talking and eating, so it was hard to tell if he was improving. I suggested trying a different clinic, but he said he was fine with the current one. "Just stay as you are," was all he said. I once saw Tommy watching TV and laughing, so I asked, "Maybe it's time to start looking for a job?" His face turned stern. "Just thinking about it makes me feel sick and nauseous," he replied. I didn't want to force him into work, especially since he's sick. But the financial strain was getting to me, and I started getting annoyed at Tommy's little comments. Even when I rushed home from my part-time job to make dinner, Tommy would sprawl on the sofa and say, "Is dinner ready yet? I'm starving." I couldn't help but wonder why I had to rush home from work to cook for Tommy, who had been home all day. After meals, Tommy wouldn't even take his dishes to the sink. Clothes were strewn around the living room, and the dishes from the lunch I prepared were still on the table. I was torn between being understanding because Tommy was sick and wanting him to at least do these small things. Then, another problem arose. I came home from work to find my mother-in-law in the house. "What are you so surprised about? Can't I visit my own son?" she said. I quickly replied, "That's not what I meant." She continued, "Why didn't you tell me Tommy is depressed? I had no idea." Honestly, what should I say? I had doubts. I wondered, shouldn't Tommy be the one to tell her? As I sighed, she glared at me. "You're taking good care of my son, right? If you had been supportive, this wouldn't have happened. Do you understand?" She's been like this since we got married, blaming me for everything. If anything happened, it was all my fault. I was subjected to old-fashioned harassment many times. I used to visit the in-laws often, but her constant harassment made me distance myself. Tommy didn't care and let her harass me, but he also didn't mind when I wanted to distance myself from her. Her attitude of indifference worked to my advantage, and even when I told her that I wanted to leave my mother-in-law, she didn't seem to care, saying, "Well, it's fine." I was able to open it. For a while, life was peaceful. But now that Tommy is home during weekdays, mother-in-law has been coming over daily. Even though my mother-in-law comes over, she doesn't lift a finger to help. She and Tommy eat the lunch I've prepared, leave their dishes, and just lounge around, making the house even messier. Cleaning has become a real chore. Since my father-in-law passed away, it's just mother-in-law in the in-laws' house. At first I thought she might be lonely, so I put up with it. But she eats dinner at our place almost every day, criticizes my cooking, and even blames me for Tommy's depression before leaving. She never contributes to groceries or brings any food. Our income is already tight, and now we have to cover her meals too. It's a tough situation. Stressed out, I decided to talk to my sister-in-law, Lucy, who lives near the in-laws' house. Lucy is the only reasonable one among them and has always stood up for me when mother-in-law was giving me a hard time. She's smart and articulate, so she can easily counter any of mother-in-law's excuses. Mother-in-law doesn't seem to like Lucy much. I told Lucy about the daily visits from mother-in-law, and the next day, she came over after work and scolded mother-in-law for lazing around. Mother-in-law was shocked by Lucy's unexpected arrival and was at a loss for words. Then, the next day after work, she came to my house with me and scolded mother-in-law for being lazy at home. Mother-in-law was surprised by the sudden appearance of Lucy, who didn't know she was here and was quite anxious. I made various excuses, but as usual, she was yelled at, and my mother-in-law's face turned red and couldn't say anything. Lucy warned her, "Next time you come, Sally will let me know, okay?" After that, mother-in-law never visited again. One problem solved, at least. Meanwhile, Tommy was indifferent and unhelpful. Even after mother-in-law stopped coming, he became increasingly lazy. With my dwindling savings and income, it was hard to cover living expenses and rent for 3 people. I was really struggling. I don't want to force Tommy to work, understanding his illness, but something had to change. I have to somehow get Tommy to work. I suggested changing his psychiatrist, but he wasn't interested. "Anywhere I'll go, it'll be the same," he said. I prepared some candidate hospitals and gave them a pamphlet, but they said, "You can stay with your current hospital." I offered to go with him, but he still wasn't interested. I started to doubt if Tommy really wanted to get better. My doubts turned into mistrust. First, I called a mental health clinic where Tommy said he was getting treatment. I wanted to know about Tommy's current situation. I found out he had only visited once a year ago and never returned. The next day, I followed him and discovered he was buying lottery tickets instead of going to the clinic. I checked his wallet that night and found a bank statement showing transfers from mother-in-law. It turns out that Tommy's lottery ticket money is given to him by mother-in-law. My mistrust in Tommy grew. I contacted a former colleague to find out why Tommy had quit his job. I had to do it secretly because Tommy had told me not to contact them. What the colleague told me was completely different from Tommy's story. It all started with a big mistake Tommy made at work, which he tried to cover up. However, when Tommy's boss found out, Tommy got scolded and lost his temper. He ended up arguing with his boss and stormed out, resignation letter in hand. Days later, Tommy kept calling the company claiming, "This is workplace harassment. You've damaged my mental health. Pay me compensation." The company was quite bothered by this. Of course, the company rejected all of Tommy's demands. Even then, Tommy persisted. When the company's legal advisor reached out to him, Tommy said, "The company made me sick. I'll get a medical certificate," and hung up. After that, he suddenly stopped contacting them. I had a hunch about what happened. Most likely, Tommy went to a psychiatrist after saying he'd get a medical certificate, but couldn't get diagnosed with depression, so he couldn't get the certificate. That's probably why he stopped contacting the company. Eventually, he got tired of working. He took advantage of my kindness, lied about going to the hospital, and lived a lazy life. I was beyond angry. I was disgusted. I didn't want to be with Tommy anymore. I planned to get divorce papers the next day after work. But then, I got a call from Lucy. Turns out, Lucy's husband got transferred and they were moving to another state. I've been really grateful to Lucy, so I decided to postpone the divorce until things settled down. 2 months later, Lucy moved. I quietly told her I was considering divorce, and she said, "I'm sorry about my foolish brother and mother. Our family ties may end, but let's remain friends." Around the time Lucy's move was complete, Tommy said, "Mom's coming to live with us next month." I asked, "What do you mean, coming to visit?" Tommy said, "No, she's moving in. She'll live with us." Apparently, with Lucy moving, his mom felt lonely. Their old house was getting run down, so she wanted to live with us, and Tommy agreed. Both Tommy and his mom were so selfish, but I just said, "Oh, okay." Inside, I'd reached my limit. I was already planning to divorce him, so I decided to act quickly. Just divorcing him wouldn't be enough, considering what he had done. The next day, while Tommy was at his usual lottery ticket spot, I called the movers. I signed a contract on the spot and smoothly prepared to leave in secret. I quickly found a new apartment. "If Mom's coming, we need to tidy up," I said as I hurriedly packed and sent my belongings to my new home. The situation with my mother-in-law moving in was so unexpected that it actually worked in my favor. Nobody suspected what I was planning. 2 days before mother-in-law was supposed to arrive, while Tommy was at the lottery ticket stand, I left the divorce papers at home and left with our daughter. Around the time Tommy would be back, he called me in a panic. When I answered, he blurted out, "What's going on? Why did you leave so suddenly?" I replied, "Didn't you see the divorce papers? That's what's going on." Tommy said, "Why all of a sudden?" Keeping my cool, I said, "Did you really think I didn't know? I know everything." Tommy sounded puzzled. "What?" So I continued, "I know why you quit your job. You weren't harassed. You're the one at fault. You've been going to the lottery stand every day instead of a psychiatrist. You didn't get diagnosed with depression, did you? I also know mother-in-law has been sending you money for lottery tickets." You could hear the panic in Tommy's voice. I told him, "You've been deceiving me, and you want me to live with a mother-in-law who's been making my life miserable? You're insane. I don't want to be with a man like you anymore, so we're getting a divorce." Tommy kept refusing. "No, please reconsider." When I said, "If you don't agree, I'll hire a lawyer and demand compensation in divorce court," he quickly agreed. Tommy had no job and no income. He probably realized he'd be in a tight spot if I demanded compensation. Later, I went back to get the divorce papers and submitted them before Tommy could change his mind. Mother-in-law hadn't moved in yet, so I was able to divorce without seeing her. After that, I got a lot of calls from mother-in-law, but when I texted Tommy, "I'll consult a lawyer," the calls stopped. As for Tommy, he and mother-in-law ended up living in an apartment together. They couldn't pay the rent and had to sell the house. Mother-in-law had sold her own house, so they had nowhere to go. They ended up in a cramped old apartment. Tommy, who hadn't worked for over a year and spent all his time on lottery tickets, had no income. Mother-in-law had squandered most of her late husband's inheritance on Tommy's lottery habit, so they were forced to live on her meager pension. As for me, I started a new life with my daughter in a rented apartment. I considered moving back to my parents' house, but that would mean my daughter would have to change schools, so we moved within the same school district. At first, I was uneasy about running into Tommy or mother-in-law, but they moved away quickly, so life became worry-free. Our living expenses dropped, and I was earning more at my part-time job. I could even buy things my daughter wanted. Even at my part-time job, my hard work was appreciated, and my salary was better. So I can buy things that my daughter wants. Money isn't everything, but I feel more relaxed now. My daughter and I are living a very happy life. We've been invited to visit Lucy and her husband at their new location, so we're planning a trip.